Welcome to She Moves Bravely, a podcast dedicated to empowering women through stories of resilience, courage, and success. I'm your host, Shantae Dent. Today, I have the honor of introducing you to a woman who moves bravely. Her name is Suzanne Jabour. Suzanne, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yes, it's an honor because as we've previously discussed, we endure a lot in life. You live long enough, you're going to go through some things. And a lot of times there is a common thread in terms of what individuals have experienced, and there will be an overlap in our experiences and how we overcame. I am confident that what you share today is going to touch the hearts of many because they've lived through it one way or another, and perhaps they haven't given themselves permission to process, or they may not have known how to process. So with that said, Suzanne, I'm going to pass the baton over to you to share your story, what you've overcome and how you overcame it.
Thank you so much. It's so interesting. I'm just going to kind of start at the beginning of this chapter of the story because, as you say, we've all got these overlapping experiences and overlapping stories that bring us to where we are. This chapter of my story that started with that middle of the night phone call that every parent dreads. I went to bed one night and the phone rang in the middle of the night, and it was the police to tell me that my son had died. And that was, if you can allow yourself to imagine it as a parent, that was exactly as horrifying and disorienting and confusing and, self-shattering, if that makes sense. I became really clear quite quickly that the person who had gone to sleep that night no longer existed. So it really was about, what on earth am I supposed to do next? And I really had such a clear vision in those early days of myself, the person I had been and the life I had had in big chunky puzzle pieces on the ground, like those big 3D puzzles they do on Survivor, like those big chunky puzzle pieces. And I'm looking around at my feet and thinking, I don't know how to pick all those pieces up. And then realizing that my arms were already full, that just getting through the day, just trying to breathe, just trying to sleep and feed myself and do all the things that are almost impossible in early grief, my arms were full and there was no space for those pieces that were on the ground. And I had to start making decisions quickly about which pieces to leave behind and which pieces to try and, stack on top of this unwieldy bundle of things in my arms without dropping anything that was literally allowing me to survive. And I feel so grateful that I had a very early knowing that my path was going to be conscious and curious. So conscious for me was about staying aware of all the emotions. And I know you talk about this so beautifully, like healing our emotions. And it was not going to work for me this time, even though as North Americans, especially, and I think most of us in Western culture, we're very well trained to stuff, ignore, downplay, deny, especially the emotions that have been labeled negative, which is most of the ones you feel in grief. And I knew that was not going to be possible. I would not survive if I did it that way. So it was facing all of the ugly emotions, the messy, the painful, the disorienting, and just embracing them all as what was expected and normal and what was happening. So there was no denying it. I knew denial was not possible. And the curiosity really was about, it really came from that vision of thinking, like, what do I do with all these broken puzzle pieces on the ground? How do I pick them up? Who am I now? What's important to me? What do I care about? Who has shown up? Who is no longer in that inner circle of friends because they disappeared? Like, there is so much to be curious about. And really, for me, I remember one of my very earliest wonderings being literally about how do you breathe? When you're curled up in a ball on the couch, crying that ugly cry where all you can do is gasp for breath, how do you release that and breathe? How do I calm my nervous system? Because I also really knew it's so interesting how our story is just one big continuation. But I knew from how I was living my life before Ben died that my intention also was to do this as healthily as possible. So I knew that I had to complete stress cycles, for example. I couldn't allow the stress to build up on my body. I couldn't allow this to be something that became malignant in my body, which I knew it easily could if I denied any of it or didn't, sort of embrace it in all its horror, really. The early first days are just horrifying, and that's the only way really to describe them. And it became, what do I know? What do I have in my toolbox? How can I really take extreme care of myself and not worry too much about what everyone else is doing or experiencing or what's happening for them? I had no bandwidth, which is fascinating as an ongoing recovering people pleaser to all of a sudden have, zero bandwidth for worrying about what is happening for anyone else. And I remember saying to my daughter, who lived with me and still does, saying to her, okay, I'm going to take care of myself first. My other priority is helping take care of you, and we're going to take care of each other. And everybody else is just going to have to adult.
The reality is, as you mentioned, any parent would know that type of phone call it's dreadful. From that moment, you knew, and you made a key statement. You said, I had to decide what's coming with me and what am I going to leave behind? What's coming along on this journey and what has to stay here? I can't even imagine all the thoughts that go on in your mind. What I do know is that sometimes in those moments, almost autopilot or the opposite, we either stop and we're paralyzed, or we're on autopilot and we don't take a moment to pause and have it take inventory. And so we try to take everything and everyone, which can essentially add more pressure and stress to this process. So that was one of your early steps to wait a minute. Let me take inventory. What's coming? What's going with me along this journey? What's staying? Who's staying? You said that as well. You lost some relationships. You lost friendships. And what powerful and empowering steps that you took. You talked about denial, and I talk about this often. Denial leads to destruction. There's something about denial where we think if I deny it, it's going to be as if it never happened.
Yeah, it doesn't work that way.
It doesn't work that way. You knew early on, if I try to hold this in, it will manifest mentally, physically, emotionally.
Yeah, it was for sure part of how I tried to live my life before Ben died. Like I was aware of, needing to be more in my body, needing to be more connected with my emotions, needing to unpack my type A personality, right? And my people pleasing and all of those things that were really no longer serving. So I was absolutely on that journey before he died. And then there's something about that kind of catastrophic rupture of your life that just is like, it's like the moment when you're in the nightclub and it's last call and the bar is closing and all the lights come on and you get to see what the reality is. It's like a bright spotlight is shone on your life.
Yeah.
And you could either, hold up an umbrella and try and stay in the shade. Right. That wasn't going to work for me. I knew so clearly that any form of denial was just going to be catastrophic for me. I wouldn't survive it. It was a matter of survival. I want to be clear, it sounds really lofty and like I was on this big enlightened path. It was about survival. It was about how do I get through today? I will not make it through today if I can't be honest about what's real. I won't make it. So I became, I'm sure terrifying to many, a grieving mom, grieving out loud. I would tell everybody, heaven help you if you asked me how I was, because I would tell you.
Yeah.
And I would talk about Ben and I would talk about what had happened. And I know that was deeply uncomfortable for a lot of people. And that was not a me problem. As my daughter would say, that's a you problem, not a me problem.
There you go.
Because as long as those of us who are suffering stay silent, nobody around us learns how to help us. And the more we can share what's real for us, of course, in places that are safe with people you trust. I'm not suggesting that anyone overstep their own boundaries, but the more we can do that, the more we'll learn about this thing that happens to all of us. in big ways and little ways that we are not talking about. And we need to talk about it because we learn from each other, right? Humans learn from stories. We learn from each other. We learn from, I say that my big goal is for us to talk about grief as naturally as we talk about what we binge watched over the weekend.
Yes.
And we talk about that because I want to know, do I like the same things as you? Should I put that on my list? Should I go home tonight and get a cup of tea and watch the whole thing? I want to know from your experience how I can use that to my own benefit. But we don't do that around grief. So things happen, like to me, my son has died. So that part of my life has exploded. I'm no longer the person I was days ago before that phone call. And somehow I have instant onset, some kind of brain disease because my brain doesn't work anymore at all, which I now know is perfectly normal and actually expected. But because we don't talk about it, I didn't know that's what was coming for me. So then you think there's something wrong with you, and then you don't want to say too much about it because maybe there is something really wrong with you, but there isn't. What you're experiencing is normal. Someone else has experienced it, but they didn't talk about it. So we're left feeling like there's something wrong with us in a time when we really need to understand that what's happening for us is perfectly normal, and we just need to hold on and ride it out and, let it go through whatever your processes are for healing those emotions and allowing them to be. We need every tool in our toolbox.
That's a golden nugget right there, Suzanne, because talking about our experiences, our grief, we know it comes with vulnerability. That level of transparency puts us in a vulnerable space. And as you mentioned, it's beneficial because it normalizes. One of my favorite words, normalizing. And, this is what I keep in mind often when I consider my journey, the journey of other women I connect with, to normalize, allow that to be a part of the beginning stages. I also believe that when we normalize those experiences in an interesting way, can accelerate the process of healing, of recovery. Because as you mentioned, we're still going to have to go through this journey and this process, whatever that looks like. But if we could get out of this state of I'm the only one, and we're stuck in the four walls of a room, and whether a literal room or not, but we stay stuck because we feel like we feel as if we're the only ones. And the moment I expose how I'm really feeling, there's a lot of fear on what might come from that. But I do appreciate you sharing the power of talking about what we're going through. And I love your context, in a safe space with a safe person, but have that outlet. And you never know who you can help, because as we said at the beginning, it might not be a grieving mom, maybe not. But at the end of the day, when we think about the tools in our toolbox, the resources, that what a process can look like, that's a part of everyone's process. It should be a part of everyone's journey, being in a position where they can normalize what they're experiencing. And along this line of grief, some individuals, as you even said for your own story, they were uncomfortable with your grieving. And I imagine how that can stifle someone from processing grief. It's just this vicious cycle of don't talk about the grief. Well, you need to talk about it. You need to express. Would love for you to elaborate on that part of the grieving process.
Yeah. And that's what's so interesting to me that I know now is the one universal about grief is it needs to be witnessed. So if you are trying to do it alone, it's not possible. It needs to be witnessed. So what that means for the rest of us, for the supporters, for the family, for the friends that want to help somebody, is we need to step out of our discomfort and our fear and be that place where someone can just speak their truth. And if we can do that and just be there, that's the magic ticket, right? There's no fixing. There's nothing that is broken that is fixable. There's no amount of glue that's going to fix this, right? And in North America, especially, we're so conditioned to, identify the problem, make a plan, execute the plan, solve the problem, move on. None of that, that robust set of tools we have, useless when it comes to grief. There is nothing to be fixed. What we need is your witnessing. What we need is your compassion. What we need is for you to step out of your own fear and discomfort and towards ours with an open, loving heart. That's all we need. You can't fix it. You can't say the right thing. There's no perfect thing. There's no perfect thing to do or say. It's all going to be messy because as a collective, we don't have this skill set. Yeah. So we have to practice. And we need to find places where we can practice where the stakes don't feel as high. Because me, in those early days as a grieving mom, grieving out loud, I am not a good first assignment. So where can we practice? What if we look at other kinds of loss? What if we look at, if someone was applying for a job and they didn't get it? Our instinct is to say, oh, well, they weren't good enough for you anyway. There's better things coming, right? There's a version of there's other fish in the sea, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. What if we started with, wow, I really know that you had a lot of expectations about what that job could provide. Yeah. And you were really interested in building, an imagined future that was possible with that job. And I bet there's a bunch of feelings that come up because that didn't happen.
I love that. I love that example. I love the mindset of exploring how do others grieve in other arenas. Perhaps that will help us know how we should better address the grieving process. And what I think about is the importance of feeling it. We talked earlier about not being in denial. It's okay to feel it. There's a phrase that I hear often. Sometimes when I hear it, I cringe. People say, get out of your feelings, get out of your feelings.
No,
and I'm like, wait, no, not yet. I mean, of course, we don't want you to stay stuck forever. But first, it's okay. Feel it. Please do. Otherwise, as you're processing in trying to recover or heal, there's still a part of you that's stuck back there because you never gave yourself permission to feel. And in the picture you painted, love it so much. You didn't get the job for a number of reasons. We can go into that later, but it's okay to be present with that person in the moment. I can imagine that, the disappointment you feel. It's okay to have that and imagine with them, like you explained. I imagine you envision yourself working there and having this type of future. And having that conversation with them, so powerful. When we give individuals that permission to feel what they need to feel, and I want to put emphasis on that initial feeling, but even the feelings that come later on down the road, those are important as well. But that initial response, it's okay. You did not get that dream job. Let's process. Let's talk about what that feels like, because there's a sense of disappointment that can come along with not getting the job you thought you were going to get. So I appreciate that example. Now, what I want to explore is, and I think this is important because when you think about the grieving process, and as you mentioned, this could be grieving from the loss of a child, the loss of a job, grieving in general. What are your thoughts about when individuals have that initial process and it could be a month later or a year later and they have a moment? I'm wondering what you say to that person, because it could go both ways. I'm not going to give my insight away just yet, but I happen to know what I think. But my heart goes out for that person who it's been a month, it's been a year, maybe 5 years, and they have a moment because they remember. And sometimes there's the pressure of, didn't that happen 5 years ago? That happened a long time ago. What's going on? What is that all about?
I think that instinct for us to say, oh, that happened so long ago, like, aren't you over it yet? Some version of that is about our own discomfort. Because really, most of those things that we say to a griever have a subtext of, I am uncomfortable. Please don't make me uncomfortable. Please don't grieve around me because it makes me uncomfortable. Could you just do that quietly, privately, preferably quickly, and I don't need to hear about it? you will have those griefy moments for years.
Mm-hmm.
I realized, within about the first 6 months or so, one of my close supporters asked me, and I said this to someone the other day, and they thought it was such a terrible question. I actually thought it was a brilliant question because of our history of having these open discussions about my grief process. And she said to me, like, how long do you think you're going to be doing this? Like, it was out of curiosity, not out of judgment.
Mm-hmm.
And what was really magical for me when she asked that question was that I realized I was going to be grieving Ben forever. Mm-hmm. So if this was a forever proposition, then how did I want my life to work? What did I want my life to be that allowed that there was going to be this hole in my heart forever? Because it doesn't go away. I will forever be his mom. He will forever not be here anymore in the physical, right? I can't hug him anymore. So what did that mean for how I wanted to grieve and live at the same time? Because ultimately for me, that's the goal. The goal is integration. There's no getting over it. We're not getting through it. We're not moving on. None of that is helpful. Mm-hmm. I understand people say it to try to be encouraging. It's not possible. Mm-hmm. We don't want to. I don't want to leave him behind. All those puzzle pieces, happily left them behind. I was very clear I was not leaving him behind. So we're going to have those griefy moments for decades, probably, for sure for years. Early grief is about the first 2 years, partly because the first year is almost impossible. All the firsts, very hard to navigate. And we know that. That's one of the things that we've talked about. Oh, that first year is going to be so tough, that first whatever day. Mm-hmm. The second year sometimes is harder. So it's important for people to hear that. The second year can be harder because we don't expect it to be terrible because we've only been told about the first one being terrible. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And because we're much more grounded in the reality that our person is no longer here. So you're having to face all of those days and all of those experiences and all of those memories, knowing that they are not here. So the second year can be even harder. I mean, I'm in year 3 and a bit. Ben died in September of 2020. So we're just past the 3-year mark. I'm having a particularly grieving month this month. And I'm super curious as to why, because there's nothing important that happens in our lives in February. There's no special date. But it's been a griefy month. And so I just get really curious about, what's happening in my life that's making that more forward than it is sometimes. I miss him every day. Yeah. I don't cry every day anymore, but I cry often. And I will miss him every day for the rest of my life. Yeah. So I had to get okay with that and okay with other people not necessarily understanding it. That's all right. We understand what we understand until we understand more. Right. So yeah. So I'm okay with that. This is a no shame, no blame conversation. And it has to be because this gap that we have is as a collective. It's a skill gap. It's a knowledge gap. It's a conversation gap. It's a big old gap that we all have together. And if we get into shame and blame, we can't learn. So we have to release the shame and blame. Yeah. There's none of that to be had. This is how we were raised. It's how our culture works. It's all kinds of things that have nothing to do with us as individuals. But as individuals, we can change it.
Yes, we can. Such powerful statements. So if you're in this position and you've struggled with this grieving process, I am hoping that you take note to what Suzanne is sharing. Suzanne has walked through the process. We're going to talk momentarily about what Suzanne is doing today. But these takeaways are giving yourself permission to feel, mm-hmm. to experience the pain, the hurt. And even in the difficult moments of feeling as if individuals don't understand, as difficult as that is, once you have that understanding, I believe that can help along the way, because that's a huge letdown. Why don't people understand? Why aren't they comfortable with my grief? And Suzanne is saying, hey, that's the reality. Unfortunately, yes, will be people who aren't as supportive. Maybe they don't understand. As you mentioned, it's how they were raised. There are a number of reasons, but mm-hmm. knowing as the individual who's grieving that that's possible, that's probably going to happen. Mm-hmm. our encouragement is that you don't allow that to stop your process.
Yeah.
And I like that you're talking about this integration, because I wholeheartedly agree. Ben is not going to ever be forgotten. He should not ever be forgotten. And your
No.
goal was, how do I live with him, with Ben in my heart, Ben in my mind? He's a part of your being, and live a successful, functional life. And so let's talk about what you're doing today, Suzanne, that allows you to help others navigate through the grieving process, continue to live a productive life without feeling that pressure of having to let go of that individual or those individuals whom they've lost.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I love speaking about it. So thank you again for opening this platform for me to come and share my story and share, a little tiny snippet piece of how grief really works, because we need to have these conversations. We just need to find safe places and have them. We need to practice with the smaller griefs. So when the big ones come, we're a little bit more confident. We're a little bit more comfortable. We have a little bit of tools in our toolbox we can pull on. Yeah. What I do now that I love doing the most is I work with organizations on the organizational level. Because the other thing that happens to grievers is they get somewhere between no days off and about 5 days off. 3 to 5 days off seems to be the norm. And then the expectation is that you're back at work like nothing happened. And unfortunately, the reality is that your life is a post-apocalyptic nightmare, and the rest of the world seems to not know or understand. So what I love to do is to go into organizations and help them learn the skills, learn the tools, understand their own emotional intelligence, how they can show up with compassion, do a little bit of grief education. So how does it really work? What are the symptoms no one's told us about? There's about 8 or 10 that are really common. How do those show up at work? And then how can we help people? Because it's all well and good to say, oh, yeah, we have grief support. We send people to the employee assistance program for some counseling, but that's not helping them when they're at their desk and they're overwhelmed. So how can we help them at their desk in their duties to be more successful, to reintegrate more seamlessly, and to really honor their experience while helping them be engaged and productive? For so many of us, we have to be at work financially. That's the reality for most. And for a lot of people, it's really helpful and comforting to have that touchstone with the normal world when ours feels so disrupted. But that can also be really isolating if that normal world feels closed to us. So how do we open that space in the workplace where we put in place some really simple policies, some really simple cost-neutral, low-cost options for people that they can access at work when they're there? Where they could, for example, a lot of us have that brain fog, very common. If you're grieving right now and your brain doesn't work, you're doing fine. It will come back. I read something the other day that said it was between 3 and 5 years. So I'm still waiting. I still have some brain fog for sure, but it is coming back, and it does come back over time. But it makes it really hard, for example, for us to remember deadlines. Makes it really hard for us to remember how multi-step processes work. So you have to do A before you do B, before you do C to get to D. I would get to B and be like, oh, okay, I made it this far, but I have no clue what's next. So how can we scaffold? How can we provide support around people so that they can be comfortable, they can be productive, they can be themselves at work? They're a grieving person trying to integrate their loss, trying to be productive, trying to help out at work, and they need some support. So I love doing that because it's shifting culture, it's talking to leaders about compassion, and it's really putting into place practical, easy things that make a big difference in that person's life.
Yes, it is. And you are bridging the gap on so many levels, Suzanne. I can imagine the benefits that organizations are able to experience, because just based off of what you've shared, I can envision the person who shows up to work, they're back and they're ready for their new norm. But as you mentioned, without this adequate support, there are so many different outcomes. You can have like a stellar employee who drops off the bandwagon, they quit, you fire them, but that doesn't have to happen when you have the right tools or the resources in place. And I'm hoping this provides a sense of inspiration for someone who's listening, because there is a way. where
Yeah.
individuals can continue to succeed, organizations and companies can continue to succeed without the grief causing everyone to come to this halt or, continuous struggle. You're providing a solution, Suzanne. You are bridging the gap. You are a light and no doubt a source of inspiration to so many. Now, how can individuals get in touch with you, Suzanne?
The best way is at my website, which is suzannejabour.com. And actually, I have a special offer for podcast lovers. So if you go to suzannejabour.com/podcasts, what you'll get is an email, because I know if you're a podcast listener, you're always looking for great episodes. So
Yes.
you'll get an email from me with my curated sort of 10 favorite recent appearances, and I shuffle them out. So they're, fairly recent, some sharing my own story, some sharing, grief education, and some talking about my programs with businesses. And that's a great way for you to continue learning. And then on the website itself, there's you can link to that from there too. There's tons of resources and blog posts and other podcasts. And of course, you can get a hold of me there and book time in my calendar and see how what I know and what I've learned through, a catastrophic rupture in my life can help you better support people, better navigate your own journey. So yeah, that's the place to start.
Wonderful. Suzanne, thank you again for joining us today. We appreciate your story, your transparency, and the support that you are offering to many. Thank you.
Thank you.